Do you remember when a bald man got offended in the Bible, and so God used 2 bears to kill 42 children?
I do remember that verse, and it's more complex than you think.
All right, let's see it.
This happens in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23.
So yes, in the Hebrew, the word little children does mean little children when you translate it, but in the context, that word is not used for little children.
So 2 concerns here. Absolutely nothing in this context indicates that these were not little children, and also little children is not rendering just the word na'arim. It's rendering the phrase na'arim katanim. So the adjective for little is explicitly attached to the plural word na'arim.
Genesis 37:2, that same word but shorter, na'ar, is used for Joseph at the age of 17.
So 2 things to say here. The first is that this creator is just repeating the line of argumentation that he's reading in a Journal of Biblical Literature article from Joel Burnett that he's going to cite later on. Joel is a friend of mine. If you have not read a reassessment of biblical Elohim, I would highly recommend it. I think this is the best treatment on the term Elohim that is available right now. But here Joel and I disagree. Second thing is that the word na'ar has a pretty broad semantic range. It can refer to boys or girls, it can refer to servants and attendants of all different kinds, and it can refer to youth from a pretty broad age range that begins in infancy. So this is the word that the daughter of the Pharaoh uses to describe the infant Moses in the basket. This is the word that the narrator and that God used to describe Ishmael after Hagar has cast her infant son under the bushes because she doesn't want to see him die in the wilderness. So it can be someone as young as just a couple months old, and the upper end of that age range variously is described at 20 to 25 years old. And so David as a na'ar at 17 is perfectly fine. It could be referring to David as an attendant or a servant, or it could just be saying he's a youth, a young man, a teenager. There's a difference when you have the adjective katan or katanim, as we have in 2 Kings 2. That is saying a small na'ar, which means it's referring to the first half of that age range. It is not referring to someone who is a grown adult or even somebody who's just 17 years old. It is someone who is younger than that.
1 Kings 3:7, Solomon as an adult calls himself a na'ar, which is again child, but he's a full-grown adult.
So this is 100% figurative language. Solomon is staring down the prospect of this enormous weight and burden and says, I am a little child, I don't know my comings or my goings.
In 1 Kings 11:17, Hadad was also called a na'ar, which is child, but again, Hadad was an adult.
This is not referring to a full-grown Hadad as a little child. This is referring to when Hadad had to flee to Egypt with his father's servants while he was still a little child.
Lawrence E. Steger says, and I quote, according to the term na'ar is applied to an unmarried male who has not yet become the head of a household.
This is not Lawrence Steger, this is Joel Burnett. Lawrence Steger is just mentioned in the sentence that follows this quote. But let's take a look at how the leading lexicons discuss this word. The standard lexicon for biblical Hebrew is Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. You can see this entry begins in the lower left with the lemma there. We see 3 different glosses. 1, lad or adolescent. 2, young man. 3, fellow, servant, attendant. We could also take a look at Klein's Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, Volume 5. And here similarly we have 3 different sets of glosses. 1, boy, lad, youth. Note that it says they're newborn, from birth, infant of 3 months, unable to speak, not yet weaned, just weaned. The next one is young man, and then the third is servant, attendant, or squire. And then for the most thorough discussion, we can go to the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, Volume 9. And here's the beginning of the entry. And here in section 2, where we use synonyms and antonyms to flesh out the meaning, you can look at the second paragraph. These observations show that na'ar clearly refers to youth. The upper boundary varies, 20, 25. The rabbis reflect similar uncertainty, so we're around 20 or 25. Then we go down to section 3, na'ar. The first sense is child, youth, young man, where we again have Moses. The next page is going to go into more detail about all the places where na'ar can be used to refer to someone as young as an infant, or a young boy, or a young man. So, as I said, this word has a fairly broad semantic range and can refer to a broad range of ages. And so we have to look at the context in order to try to determine where we're going to plot the specific referent on that range of ages. And when it is accompanied by the adjective small, katan, it should be plotted in the early part of that range of ages.
David was also called a katan, which is another way of saying na'ar, which again means young child, but he was this age when he fought Goliath.
So when used as an adjective, katan means small or young. When used as a substantive, which is what's going on here, it refers to the youngest in a series. And so even as an old man, David will still be the youngest in reference to his older brothers.
Now, those kids who were killed by the she-bears were also called yaladim, which is another way to say young children, so that could go towards your argument. Except that same word is used for Rehoboam's young advisors who were not children.
Again, this is a word that can refer to a broad range of ages, although even more than na'ar, yeled refers to younger children.
Joel Burnett notes that this word is often associated to young men who have some sort of royal association.
That is when it is being used to refer to attendants, squires, servants, and I'm not aware of a single usage that very clearly evokes that sense that is qualified with the adjective small.
So if we consider the historical context and the author's intention, it's more likely that Elisha was rebuked by unmarried men with some sort of connection to a royal sanctuary. These are men who understood the consequences of denying a prophet of God, which fits perfectly in the narrative of 2 Kings. Children being killed for mocking a bald man would be completely out of place in the context of 2 Kings and wouldn't make any sense towards the narrative.
So I would absolutely agree that this is not a story about children being killed by bears just for mocking someone for being bald. The rhetorical point is very clearly to show that Elisha is the authorized successor of Elijah and his authority should not be challenged. However, the argument that these are grown men and not little boys, as the text explicitly states, is weak and is based on misrepresentations of the use of this word in these other passages.